Welcome to Tomorrow's People, the podcast brought to you by Personio and me, Perry Timms. Everything starts with people and the systems of work that people are in, according to our next guest, Barry McNeill, are broken. We'll hear from Barry on his unique perspectives in his work around how we can change tomorrow's state of work for tomorrow's people. So welcome to Tomorrow's People podcast, Barry McNeill.
Thank you very much, Perry. Great to be here.
And I think back to when we met, it was during COVID when it was all about through screens.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we kind of knew each other,
Yeah.
talked several times, kind of interacted loads, and actually didn't meet until probably about 2 months ago.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it was July 23.
Yeah.
And it was at that time when a lot of work was discombobulated and didn't make sense. Yeah.
Discombobulated. What a great word.
Yeah, I thought I'd get that in early doors. So I guess if we talk about work, what kind of work is occupying you right now? What are the sort of things that are giving you the sort of stimulus and the focus?
Sure. Okay. So the kinds of things that I get involved in is really helping clients, helping organizations to really think about how they grow and scale,
Yep.
but also how they really kind of create a very kind of human-centric ways of working, ways of operating. So the whole kind of theme, the whole agenda from my perspective is all about humanizing work.
Yeah.
And I think, lots of people probably could have talked about, humanizing work's been around for ages. Why are we kind of really focusing on it right now? But we're at such an amazing point in terms of, fourth industrial revolution, the advent of, it's just beginning to get our heads around what it means for AI, machine learning.
Yeah.
That kind of this huge pace of change in terms of technology. And yet, we're trying to kind of think about the future of work and new ways of work in that environment. And yet we still haven't really sorted out work from an old perspective.
Yeah.
In the kind of, a thing we say a lot is, actually the world of work is fundamentally broken.
Yeah.
And so humanizing work just becomes this overarching theme that we kind of hook everything that we're kind of focused in on around.
Yeah. And I think if we look at statistics like Gartner's analysis and the Gallup poll, engagement's down and anxiety is up, and we look at things like the Health and Safety Executive and the Office of National Statistics on stress at work.
Absolutely.
Again, higher, at a point in time where it's almost like, well, we've been through a bit of a trauma, what with COVID and so on, but surely now there's a sense of relief. It kind of doesn't look like it, does it? No.
I think so COVID absolutely accelerated and accentuated a lot of what was going on, but actually pre-COVID, before COVID ever came along, a lot of those kind of warning signs and symptoms were there.
Yeah.
And what we have seen time and time again is that there's been some kind of attempts to try to do some stuff around it. And, I sometimes kind of a little bit critically kind of go, actually, what we do a lot of is we're trying to kind of paper over the cracks of what is happening and the issues that are going on, rather than really get under the skin and under the surface of it.
Yeah, that's a really fair way of looking at it, because it's almost like we go, that'll be all right, like you say, just papering over, but it's fragile, it breaks again, and it's almost like we perhaps get doubly disappointed because we thought we might have temporarily fixed it, right?
Yeah.
And
that's actually part of the issue, actually.
Right.
This sort of mindset of we've got to fix it.
Yeah.
Like, so much of what we try to do is we kind of try to help. When I kind of think about a lot of the work I did earlier on in my career, so very much learning and development focused,
Right.
which was about trying to help teams, individuals fix what was going on and kind of adapt to work more effectively and more efficiently within the system as it was, as opposed to designing a better system.
Yeah.
And that kind of whole kind of trying to adapt to what is rather than design a better could be becomes a huge part of what really kind of drives the work we're trying to do.
Yeah. I mean, it feels like a really compelling urge, doesn't it, to go, hang on a minute, if we didn't keep fixing, if we actually created something new, it talks to that Bucky Fuller quote, isn't it? About, don't try and change it, create something else that makes that
absolutely.
obsolete.
Yeah.
It's a hard ask though, isn't it, for people to do that?
It's a huge ask.
Yeah.
I mean, when we kind of, so a big part of the work we get into is really kind of stepping back and adopting a kind of systems perspective on what is going on within organizations. And trying to do some kind of design thinking around how you operate and how you redesign the way that system functions. And that's complex work. It's really challenging because, of course, what most people are doing is they're trying to, they're working within that system. They've got their own perspective from within the system. And they are trying to make the best of what is in and around them. And so whether you're talking about, what the people within the kind of people profession and the kind of HR functions within organizations, what they're trying to achieve, or whether it's people in the kind of the guts of the business, they've got their own perspective, their own narrow view of what is happening within the system. So to be able to step out of that, look at the complexity of it and redesign that's a real challenging ask.
And I guess we, and I mean you and I, but also the listeners, hear about some examples where actually you think, oh, wow, they've got it. They've done it. They have reinvented themselves or whatever. And we've got lots of little folklore markers, haven't we, about things like the Netflix deck. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
And then you look at things like Best Companies and some of the stories that come through that, and you talk about Airbnb's policies. What we are starting to see, though, at the time we're recording this, and I doubt it will change that radically, is almost like an urge for people to snap back a bit, almost the opposite of what you said. So, lots of companies who said, oh, it's okay, we'll be flexible forever, are now saying, no, come back into the office where it's that kind of work. Is that a kind of warning for you that there's more to do?
Hugely.
Right.
Yeah. So we are, I think the opportunity that COVID presented for organizations, for leaders, for anyone in the workplace, essentially, was to kind of really start to rethink how do we work? Why do we work this way? How can we work in a different way? So there was it was a horrendous time for a lot of people, and I'm not taking away from the real challenge that COVID and that many people lived through and experienced as a result of it. However, the opportunity to rethink was huge, and what is really kind of so there's a lot of things that have come out from that, where there are a lot of organizations that have actually gone, wow, this worked pretty well. We can continue on this journey, but you are there is so where you were seeing some of that happening pre-COVID. I think there's been an increase in the number of organizations who are on that journey of experimentation and willing to explore what that looks like, which is really exciting. So there's a brilliant opportunity there for us to really kind of continue to shape what that future of work looks like. But there is then also a kind of fairly hefty kind of group of organizations in the middle that have definitely kicked back actually harder.
They haven't.
And getting really quite dictatorial messaging coming from chief execs around, unless people are coming in, 5 days a week, and kind of really kind of tying people back to that way of thinking around the office as the the kind of the ball and chain essentially. Then they're kind of losing so much of what the flexibility aspect really kind of offered them.
I see it labelled as almost like a employee-employer struggle, like a tug of war. I mean, whether that's true or not, I don't know. But I guess for people like us who thrive on the possibility of that significant shift, we're now going, oh no, we could lose faith, couldn't we?
We could lose faith. However, I'm kind of really keen for us not to lose the momentum of what has happened before. And it's interesting. I mean, you've positioned there a kind of employee versus employer. I think a lot of the work that we do, both of us actually, really sits in all of those polarities. So whether it's employee, employer, whether it is the business agenda versus the people agenda, all of those types of polarities are those kind of extremes is where we end up in really kind of quite unproductive conflict, debate, positional kind of, people kind of getting really grounded and rooted in their opposing views. And so actually a big part of what we end up really kind of helping to facilitate is how do you come together with that both and perspective? So, that's what Barry Johnson's work and Brian Emerson and so on, they're kind of looking at how do we navigate polarities in a constructive way to find a third path through. And that third path, I think, is the really exciting journey where we kind of don't get stuck in some of those opposing views.
I like that, because the third path, people talk about the office and remote, and they talk about a third space. And people talk about a third way. There are all sorts of dimensions. Perhaps you're right. We are underplaying and we're getting too fixated with the polarity thing.
But then I suppose if you look at what's going on at the moment globally, we are currently in geopolitically where there's a huge amount of polarity thinking going on. There's a real extremes of perspective, and therefore the role of anyone trying to help to find and navigate that third path, wherever that is, whether that's politicians. Or kind of facilitators or the people profession in whatever context we're really thinking about that, people have really got to start focusing in on how they navigate that polarity. And there's a book, The Highest Common Denominator, which is a really great read around how to use this sort of approach on facilitation. To really a convergent facilitation to try to help people navigate out of this polarized perspective and more into how can we do some both and thinking here and come up with an alternative.
Like that. And the highest common denominator kind of gives it more of a lofty feel, doesn't it, rather than zero sum?
Absolutely. And the kind of this zero sum thinking that is so dominates the kind of business world, we've really got to get beyond that. We've got to get more into this sort of abundance mindset and go, actually, there's a way of us thinking about this, thinking about it really differently.
Abundance is nice. I like the concept of that as a pursuit of something which is just so much more plentiful and regenerative and so on. Do you think some of the reasons we're either getting a bit retrograde or polarized is about leaders? Do you think they're in the kind of culprit mode?
I'm not sure I want to label anyone in the culprit mode. However, I do think that there's a really valid point in there around what are the expectations that leaders have of what work means and what the I suppose the kind of expectations of their people are. And I think that is, many people who are now in leadership roles have got to those leadership roles through working their way up through the existing system. And therefore the expectation of the existing system of work is something that they've been through. They cut their teeth on that. You hear it time and again, people kind of going, well, I did my time on that in my kind of way up to get to the lofty heights now of where I am from a leadership position. So I think that having been through that system and operated in that way, many of them, and again, this is a bit of a sweeping generalization, so I kind of want to be really careful about that. But I do think many leaders have this expectation of, well, it worked for me and look where I've got to. And therefore, actually, that is what the expectation of work should be.
For sure.
And, we have definitely seen trust has continued to be an issue. In days pre-COVID, when everyone was desk-based, there used to be, management development training around walk around the office, and a big part of that was actually about visibility, but also about kind of making sure that people are working.
Supervisory,
And the rise in surveillance technology that
Good
happened
point.
as soon as a big chunk of the workforce went to remote working, and organizations starting to bring in surveillance technology to really monitor are people working, and how frequently are people, is a particular keystroke on their machine. That is a real worrying indicator of levels of trust, and leaders kind of needing something to prove or to validate that people are actually working as hard as they think they should be working.
And that's a really good point. And I think if I were to make the case for the defense on my accusation, I would be saying the same thing. Through the system, what else can you expect them to do? Complex world, what can you expect them to be able to do in that sort of uncertainty? So when that happens, we do tend to kind of entrench ourselves with what worked before, right? So I'm guessing that the agenda to humanize work would kind of get nods still from those people. They're not anti that. They're like, of course. And I do that anyway. And perhaps there might be a bit of an illusion about the level of trust. But I wonder whether you think there's something about who can start to recalibrate the machinery and give us a sense of what leadership should be like in this humanized future.
Well,
who or how?
Yeah, I mean, so I think there are some really great examples of pioneers that are doing just that and have done just that.
Yeah.
So it won't surprise you. I mean, a big part of the work we do Semco Style Institute UK is following the kind of the pioneering leadership of Ricardo Semler's work. He started on that journey the
decades
1990s
ago.
Exactly. At a time when no one else was really talking about this stuff.
Not at all.
So, so he is definitely a kind of a real example of. But there's been so many other organizations, so many other examples since then of far more pioneering types of leaders who are setting a different tone. They are not needing to embed so many different ways of controlling within their organizations. Instead, they're kind of really building organizations from the ground up that are trust-based, that are treating people within their organization as adults. And there's I can't remember where the quote actually comes from, but around we all manage to kind of work through all of the things, the decisions we need to do day to day in our lives. Why then, when we come to the office, do we think that people are not able to kind of make their way through their own day, making autonomous decisions and kind of doing the things that are right for them to do in order to achieve the results they need to achieve?
Great point. And I guess you're right. Ricardo was a kind of standout differentiator in what we could even conceive as leadership at the time. And we now look back on that and kind of go, yeah, like it's so obvious that you liberate and you trust and you see people thrive and they have a better experience of work. They're more loyal, they're more committed, customers love them more. You almost think the plus points seem to radiate out from that kind of ethos. But here we are still in a position stubbornly resistant to that. Yeah.
And the kind of stubborn resistance is largely just, I think, to do with it's not what our expectations are. It's not what we have grown up with, or and we do loads of work with different organizations trying to kind of help them to think through what does it really mean to let go of control. And there's a real risk point, I think, for a leader to go down that type of route. Because there's, when you step into leadership roles, your reputation is on the line. You've established a really kind of strong track record of delivery through your own career, and then the way that we kind of typically develop leaders is they could have, if they're lucky, they go through some form of management development. And of course, a lot of what management development does is it kind of really thinks about the controls and the processes
good point.
that you need to kind of adhere to and monitor people on. So there's a big bit around kind of monitoring results and monitoring how people do that. Then, if people are lucky, they get into some leadership development where we start to change the language a little bit. But actually that journey through, if they do go through a development journey and support for it, kind of leads people a little bit into that way of thinking and that pattern of thinking. And the other thing that we often see is that, quite often people don't get any development or support going through. And, that ends up being that people then go, well, okay, who are my role models? Who have I seen? What's my experience of my leader? And actually, therefore, many of the similar patterns just sort of replicate. Absolutely.
And I think back to my time, because I was one of those people who I had to wait a bit before I got the management development course. So you kind of find your way through it, don't you? And you have so many doubts, don't you? You're like, am I doing this right? Am I here because should people hate me and fear me or like me and take advantage? You've got so many things going on there. But the one thing I can remember that absolutely worked for me is just talking to people saying, well, who are you and what you're here for? Nobody taught me that. It was almost like, I just want to know who you are. And like, what is it about what you do that gives you a bit of a kick or not?
But what you're talking about there, Perry, is humanizing work. It's talking about the kind of seeing beyond the person to really kind of get to know the person on a human level. So it's about human connection. And what a lot of organizations do, a lot of organizational practice kind of misses the point on some of that. I do a lot of work with people who are very early on in their kind of management or first time management kind of level. And when you start to have conversations with people about, well, how well do you know your team? What really drives the people within your team? There often is a bit of a kind of stony silence. Haven't really thought about that. Or when you start getting into things like, well, what really motivates, what drives these people? How do they do their best work? What we tend to see is that people kind of go, well, I'm motivated by X, Y, Z, therefore they must be motivated by X, Y, Z. So there's assumptions there about the things that really motivate and engage them. And of course, what organizations do when it comes to motivation, mostly is all about the kind of extrinsic motivators. It's all about the rewards,
perks,
pay rewards package, the perks that you kind of throw to people. So it's all very extrinsic.
Good point.
And rather than getting into the real intrinsic, what's really at the heart of this. And so, that arguably reinforces this view that we kind of tend to dehumanize work rather than really humanize it.
That's a nice way to look at it, that some of that is well intended for process, but actually counter human measures, right? So, and how let's say somebody was listening to this going, oh, do you know what? I'm kind of feeling I want to do that, but I look around me and nobody else will back me on this, or they're all doing it their mechanistic controlling way. So am I just going to set myself up for a bigger challenge than they might be, mightn't
they? They absolutely can do. So the number of times we end up speaking to someone who's in either kind of an internal OD role or HR. I'm going to stop saying HR because I'm kind of far more leaning towards people and culture type of role. But they're in that type of role, and they really just feel like a lone voice, kind of feel quite isolated because they're trying to affect change, trying to really kind of help to address and challenge a new way of thinking, and continuing to kind of get the kind of same kind of pushback constantly, and this goes back to one of those polarities I talked about around the, it's the business agenda or the people agenda. And I've worked with a lot of people in people and culture roles who are constantly being criticized and judged for not being close enough to the business.
Right.
And I had a similar type of criticism myself earlier on in my career. You're just not commercial enough.
Right. Right.
And when I kind of really try to sort of unpick and understand what exactly does that mean, actually, the expectation is about, well, actually, you've got to kind of make the really kind of hard business decisions. You've got to, we've got to be
Know
kind
the
of
numbers.
know the numbers, be willing to kind of, if you've got to make the tough decisions about who we need to cut, then we just need to kind of do that.
Grr.
Yeah, exactly. And there is a
Yeah.
there's a kind of inherent, I mean, you could have done a bit of an aggressive type
Yeah.
of face there, but
Yeah.
it kind of feels a little bit like
It does,
that to be commercial, to be business minded actually means that
Yeah.
you can't bring compassion
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And we fundamentally
Yeah.
believe that you can do both
Yeah.
and you need to do both and.
I was just thinking how like cruel it feels.
Yeah.
Less of a war for talent and more a war on talent.
Yeah.
Which is like, how on earth did we get into that oppressive way of being? And you rightly talk to the torchbearers and the people who perhaps we look to for inspiration. And let's just say they're not just whimsical, temporary bursts into something that dissipates. There are some ongoing, long-standing success stories about actually how you let go of controlling.
Yep.
But you bring people into a position where it's they who are controlling like outcomes and success and stuff like that. So it's not a new science. It's not a flimsy thing. It's got a backstory, hasn't it?
It does, hugely. So one of the poster child kind of examples that is often talked about. So Joost Blok and Buurtzorg in the Netherlands.
Yeah.
And has grown a huge organization.
Yeah.
So 15,000 kind of people type size organization.
Yeah.
So no kind of small enterprise.
At scale, yeah.
Community health organization. So they're kind of out in the community providing support to patients in homes who are needing care. And really what Joost Blok and his business partners did was really kind of go, well, the problem with most care homes is that, it is centralized decisions forcing and imposing impact onto people who are at the kind of front end or the front line of what we're doing. So, totally shifted the balance there, put the power into the hands of people who were there interacting with patients out in the community. And that focus is enabling change or enabling that kind of service delivery and quality to be and decisions that affect that to be driven from people right at the front line, right at the kind of coalface of it. That is the kind of where we definitely see kind of the future of how organizations need to develop and need to grow.
And that also links to other organizations we know in different sectors. So whether it's Nucor Steel in the US, whether it's Jaipur Rugs in India. I mean, we can put pins in the map, can't we, around the world for organizations who have said, as a leader, I'm going to let go of certain things, and you people in this enterprise will make it so. And so in that respect, it feels like the leap of faith should be a little bit more comforting for people, but there's some reservations.
It should be because, it's about kind of, can people see examples of how this works? Yes, there are examples out there. Can people really kind of start to reframe and rethink their kind of patterns of thinking, and that kind of whole process of unlearning what I think leadership needs to look like, unlearning what it means for me to be a leader, and relearning a new way of thinking about this is
nice frame.
It's a real challenge for people, but actually stepping out of that comfort and kind of feeling the stretch of that is actually a really nice thing.
And I think you've got me thinking now about that whole unlearn thing, which I think is really pivotal to this, considering what we said earlier on about how the system tends to shape how you are. And I can imagine there will be people here perhaps feeling like, I am a leader, I'm at odds with how I have to lead in the system I'm in, and I want to do more of this stuff that you're talking about here. So I guess it's back to that point of, how do we activate? I mean, are you seeing, not necessarily a prescribed way, because I think that's not what we're saying, but almost like some really nice ways to get going, to create momentum and so on? What's the sort of, not quite the roadmap, but almost like, a few options that people can start to experiment with? Are those starting to form in your mind?
Yeah, definitely. So within both, I work across kind of two different kind of real focus areas. Work Extraordinary, and one part of the work I do is working with scale-up leaders. So at kind of very kind of early stage of growth. And in many ways, they've not really yet bedded into
they're still forming that.
Exactly. So that they're not kind of yet heavily set in their kind of ways of being. And of course, many of those types of leaders are quite interesting, because they're, they've maybe taken a decision fairly early on in their career. No, there's a different way we want to do this. So actually, in some respects, they're kind of tend to be a little bit more open to things. The challenge at that kind of perspective, or that kind of level, can be, well, we're the founders, we're the owners. It's our business. So there's still a little bit
Very
of
attached.
our way or the highway type of thing. And so kind of just beginning to kind of help leaders in that type of environment, or founders in that type of environment, really kind of rethink about, okay, what does it feel like now to kind of start to create far more of a collective organization where you want people to be maybe not kind of invested in terms of ownership, but certainly invested in terms of
like spirit.
Exactly. Their engagement, their participation.
It's a nice way to look.
And that's a kind of quite I suppose an easier route in sometimes, because they're having to do a little bit less unlearning. In more of our kind of corporate clients, or kind of larger organizations that we work with from a kind of Semco style institute point of view, some of the routes in there, so tends to be kind of people who are kind of going, well, culturally we want a different type of culture. We recognize that we don't really want to be too corporate. We want a culture that is freer, that is more autonomous. But we just don't quite know how
to do it.
And there's some really nice practices within the kind of whole toolkit of the Semco style practices, which really kind of starts to kind of help experimenting around that. So, for instance, step back management's a really kind of great practice, just to kind of start thinking about what happens if I step back slightly and start to allow a little bit more kind of so this is sort of about being in control without controlling. So kind of enabling some of those kind of perspectives to happen. There's another one as well, kind of leader on demand is a really great one, which really kind of helps leaders to recognize, actually, within this piece of work or within this project, I'm not the best person to kind of lead on this. Someone else has got a particular passion for it, or is particularly energetic around it, or is motivated to do it. So actually, what happens if we can just start to kind of swap around this role of leader and allow the right person to emerge as the leader. And when you kind of start to experiment with those types of things, which are relatively low risk things to start to experiment with, that starts to bring just a different perspective, a different way of thinking about things.
Hey friends, it's Perry Timms, host of Tomorrow's People. In HR, support is key. Supporting your work, your people, and your organisation. Personio truly gets that. They've got your back with top-notch support in your time zone. Visit personio.com and see how they can support all your HR work. That's personio.com. And I think the kind of nearness perhaps of it helps, because it doesn't feel like you're having to get everybody's permission and go massive with it. Just kind of keep it nice and cozy. And I think that it's named well, isn't it? Step back. I remember back in the day when I was taught by lots of other managers, you've got to get good at delegating, they said. And I was never very good at it. Not because I didn't trust people, because actually quite the opposite. I looked at them and thought, they're all too busy. Why do they want more of me throwing stuff at them? And I used to do the opposite and take stuff off them. So I was never any good at that. However, there's a difference, isn't there, between delegating and liberating?
Yeah. I really like that. That's a really nice perspective on it, because I think the traditional view of delegation is very much rooted into what we typically see as this sort of hierarchical structure of what sits within organizations, and work gets divvied up and allocated out and then cascaded down through the organization. And that's still such a dominant view
isn't it?
of how we think about organizations. And don't get me wrong, we definitely advocate for flatter, more fluid, more agile organizations. But and that doesn't mean that within that there isn't some form of natural hierarchy, but it's less formalized and rigid and structured. And so that's a really great example of delegation is a good tool to learn in order to help you be more successful in the current hierarchical system.
Great point.
But but what that does is it brings with it other issues, because what it does is it fails to kind of really engage. Going back to what you said right at the beginning about the data, about the kind of Gallup survey and all those types of, the huge proportion of people who are currently disengaged, who are overstretched, overworked,
exactly that,
are then getting more stuff being given to them in either a good way or a bad way, depending upon how well developed someone is around delegation. And then over and above that, whilst people are really overstretched, really overworked, we then suddenly go, I tell you what, we're going to do a big restructure of the organization or kind of a big, huge change program without freeing up any capacity to take that on. So people who are already overstretched and overworked are just sort of going, oh, here we go again. It's like another thing for us to think about. And they either just sort of try to put their head in the sand and ignore it.
It'll go away.
Exactly. Because if I ignore this one, in another 3 months' time, there'll be another one. Or they kind of try to do the right thing and try to take it on. And then we have the huge crisis we have around well-being and stress within organizations.
And again, it talks to the dehumanized bit there, doesn't it? Because it's almost like that's a ridiculous expectation, again, going back to your earlier point. And do you think there's something in the system that is causing that to happen, that we've got so ritualized within it? We really do need something like a handbrake, hard stop, disrupt, blow it up, whatever it is. Are you thinking that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I've got experience of when I was still working in large kind of global consulting organization. There was an annual ritual of restructure, change within the organization, and which ultimately, as part of that kind of annual ritual, several people who were at the kind of top of the tree in there ended up being made redundant. And I ended up with my turn at one point within that kind of process. And the really sad thing about that scenario and that situation and that pattern that organizations can get into is we tended to kind of go, oh, obviously there's something going on, because it was pretty much the only time that we kind of saw someone from HR coming up to the floor to the organization. And you kind of go, that's a really sad type of scenario of those patterns that organizations get into. So to break that up
Yeah.
is definitely
Yeah.
a big kind of part of it.
Yeah.
And you've that whole kind of concept of learned helplessness.
Yeah.
And there is I can't quite remember who to attribute this to, so apologies in advance. But there was a study that was done looking at kind of fleas in the jar.
Oh yeah.
I don't know if you've heard this
I think
before.
so.
Where you put a kind of pile of fleas into a jam jar, and because what fleas do is they jump. But when you kind of put that kind of jam jar lid on, what the fleas do is they kind of learn just how high they can jump, that they don't bang their heads, and so they stay within the constraints or the limitations of what they are doing within that environment, within that system.
Yeah.
And if you take the jam jar lid off, the fleas, they continue to jump within the constraint.
Oh wow.
They won't jump out of the jam jar until you shake it, and shake it up, and then suddenly you can release them. So going back to that earlier point about liberating, we need to be shaking up the system, the way that it currently operates, and whether that's a kind of annualized ritual of redundancies at a senior level, or other types of ways, other types of patterns that are currently existing within the organization we're operating in. If we don't shake it up, then what we see is that we are limiting, we're constraining the creativity and the spirit of the people who are operating within that structure.
For sure. And like you then pointed to, the outcomes that we're after as an organization are somewhat stunted by that, aren't they? So there's a direct link to that, even though people may not see it. Do you think there is a challenge for us, though, if we create that liberation, that people might be a little bit like, yay, I'm liberated. Oh, what now? Suddenly I feel really uncomfortable about the fact that this is different.
Yes.
Does that happen?
Yes, it can happen. I think it kind of comes around. It depends, obviously. So how are we then kind of supporting what that redesign looks like? How are we thinking about engaging people in, if we are starting to kind of expand our thinking about what a new potential or new possibilities look like? How do we kind of then start to kind of think about what that can look like? And that whole piece around participation is a huge thing for the work we do. So whether you are, as I say, whether it's what I'm doing with Work Extraordinary or what we're doing with Semco Star, that kind of participative approach to organizational design and input is really, really important. And it's fascinating. I was doing some work with a transformation team at a bank tail end of last year, and we were doing some work to kind of ultimately my role was to go in and to help them to kind of coach through thinking about an organizational change. What they were trying to do, so they were kind of, their focus was culturally we need to kind of create a greater level of autonomy. We want people to feel there's a kind of far more flexible, free environment, and yet their approach to change was completely non-participative.
Wow.
It was very so what they were trying to do was to get to a very different type of output. But what their approach to it was very top down and kind of, let's come up with a plan ourselves within this room. And they were trying to kind of over-engineer this approach to change and transformation. And it was a real light bulb moment for them when they suddenly went, oh, how we approach this change starts to set the tone for the culture.
I was thinking exactly that. I was kind of in a vision mode as you were describing it, and I was picturing like a boardroom where this discussion's taking place. And I'm almost like, it's hardly transformative what you're talking about. It literally feels like you're just supercharging, revving, whatever it is. The whole point about transformation almost seems to be that if we are not transformative in how we go about transforming, kind of forget it, really.
Absolutely. It ends up just another imposed top-down change initiative that people who are already overstretched and overworked have got to try and fit into everything else.
So there's a kind of DER thing there, isn't there? And maybe a drop mic and a clonk thing that people might be feeling as they're listening to this now. It's like, oh, hang on, actually, I can model a transformation in the way I transform, which is fab. Yeah. And the experiments thing that you talked about there is where we can perhaps start to see them as a series of aggregated experiments. Yeah. And I'm guessing that's a tactic when you're thinking about the scale stuff that you're doing. It's not just a big thing, is it? It's lots of things that connect.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So the biggest, I think probably the biggest blocker for any organization going down this route is it can just feel so huge, so big. Yeah. And therefore, let's take that off the table. I mean, I've been on a journey of experimenting with new ways of working personally for, I don't know, somewhere in the region of 7, 8, 9 years now. And in the journey of going down that route, I looked at lots of different kind of options, did lots of different methodologies around how you go about doing that and creating that. And one of my big challenges was quite a few other methodologies and options out there. They kind of require that kind of big bang change. You know, suddenly we're going to wake up. It's a Monday morning, and all the old rule book totally thrown out the window. Here's a new set of rules that we're going to govern by and operate by, and that feels huge. Easier to manage on some of the kind of scale-up organizations that I operate with, where, but actually even then, doing change at that level for even a kind of 20 headcount business. It's a huge amount of work. So really kind of operating or thinking about how can we start to introduce elements of experiments at a far smaller scale. Start to kind of get, and actually even when we're thinking about bringing in experiments, doing that in a participative way with the team, introducing them into the concept of we're going to try something a little bit differently. Let's work on developing this together. How are we going to try to make that work, and having a framework by which they can then evaluate how that operates and how that works. Does this add value? Great, let's carry on doing it. Does it not add value? Okay, what do we need to iterate? How do we learn from this? Iterate and then move on.
There's something about the sort of fluidity, the motion. And I was thinking about how, you know, perhaps at times of crisis, organizations have had to let all those rules go anyway, right? And people play in a different way. And I guess there's an urge for people to want to go back to stability now the crisis has been solved. When you've just touched on a brilliant point, which is we learned then and we showed up differently then and we did things differently then and we got great outcomes in adversity. We could normalize that. So you don't want to create chaos just to make that happen either, do you?
No, you don't. But there's a really nice I'm going to go tangential now for a moment. I'm giving you the heads up and I'm warning you. This concept which I've come across recently called tensegrity. Which is it's a kind of combination of tension and integrity.
Right.
And the way I stumbled across it, right? I have fairly recently started running. And very randomly, I was given a book for my birthday called The Lost Art of Running by Shane Benzie.
Wow.
And I kind of, I've got so many books on the go and all the rest of it. And I was like, okay, I'm not sure if I'm going to get into that. But anyway, and it just so happened, I'd finished something else I was reading. I was like, so I picked it up and started to have a read through it. And it's a fascinating look at how we think about anatomy,
right?
And the real way of, or how to think about anatomy in a slightly different way. What this guy did, so he's a running coach, and he trained in biomechanics.
Okay.
So which looks at running from the perspective of your skeleton structure.
Wow.
And your muscles.
Wow.
Okay.
Yep.
But quite a mechanistic way of thinking about, how foot placement, arms, your skeleton,
the physics of it.
The physics of it.
Yeah.
And so what he realized was he was learning all this stuff. He was trying it with people and wasn't really getting the results he was looking for.
Okay.
So he went and did a field study in Ethiopia, field study in Kenya, kind of looking at some of the world's best
Best runners.
runners
Yeah.
who run in a very, very different way. And what he discovered was this is the whole kind of fascia part of the elasticity
Yeah.
of the human body,
Yeah.
which is all of the kind of connective tissue.
Right.
And that's where the real power in
Okay.
how to run more effectively comes from.
Wow. What a realization.
And what I love about it is this concept of tensegrity.
Right.
It's not about the things that are locked and the blocks, so the
Yep.
structural
Yeah.
part
Yeah.
of the way that an organization is.
Yeah.
If I transfer this into organizational
Yeah.
language,
Yeah.
it's not about the structure and the rigidity as in the skeleton.
Yeah.
It's actually about the kind of interaction of the elasticity, the
Wow.
tension between those functioning parts. And therefore, as you are adapting things, as you're kind of looking at how teams evolve and adapt in a far more fluid way, it's about the connective tissue,
Brilliant.
the ways of collaborating between those different rigid elements that become far more important. That's where the real power.
Wow.
And you know, when you look at some of the Ethiopian runners or Kenyan runners, you know, they're the ones who are kind of doing, you know, a marathon in something like 2 hours,
times,
5 minutes or something like that.
I know.
And the real power, it comes from the elasticity
Wow.
of the human body or of the system,
Yeah.
not from the
Rigidity.
rigid structured parts of it.
That's such a good metaphor for what we've been
Yeah.
talking about, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because there does need to be that scaffold underpin, whatever you want to call it, right? And some of that comes from this is our mission and purpose. And some of that comes from this is our non-negotiables, right? About what we stand for, how we'll be. But then all of that stuff in the middle that you're talking about there is the interplay of all of those and how we then train, learn, compete, rest, regenerate. I mean, it's all of those things, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And that therefore, you know, when we get hung up on things like, you know, the kind of formal aspects of, you know, if I think about how a lot of organizational design work typically happens, it's quite quantitative.
It is, isn't it?
It's looking at, you know, numbers of headcount. Even the language, spans of control.
I know.
Makes me shudder.
I know.
All of that type of approach is kind of looking at the kind of formal aspect. But actually, there's a huge informal network of the way things happen within organizations. And being able to start to go beyond the formal aspect of how we think about organization, even culture, actually. Often we tend to focus far more on the kind of formalized aspect of culture, or we think about values even in a kind of the formal.
Very true.
And you think about, you know, values written on a wall as opposed to what's the kind of lived behavior, what's the informal aspect of it. So the ways of working, the informal aspect of how collaboration happens within an organization, how teams cooperate, collaborate, hand over points, work together around those types of things. That becomes far more powerful. And so actually some of the work that, so a piece of work I did in the, tail end of last year, we could have worked through this fairly small organization, 22 headcount business. And what they were having real problems with was the handover points between the sales team, the client services team, and the kind of the distribution and those types of things. So actually, we can start to go, well, what would happen if we start to bring the team together in more of a think about kind of multidisciplinary teams. They broke into kind of smaller pods, and they ended up with a network of pods within the organization. That the fluidity of that and the interconnectivity of that enabled them to so that they've accelerated the way they're doing things. The responsiveness to customers is significantly improved, and the handover transition points and all of the points of conflict and tension are actually kind of now working in a far more fluid way. And so that kind of tensegrity, the tensions are kind of keeping the integrity of the way that organization can now grow.
That's great that word has that almost like undulation.
Yeah, it
It?
does.
So, just as you were describing that shift, it suddenly felt more human to me, even though I've never spoken to them, don't know it.
Yeah.
But just you describing silo-based handovers versus multidisciplinary knitted teams just feels much more human. So I guess what we're starting to see really is, yes, there is a dominant system. Yes, it's really tough to change it, but that doesn't mean to say you shouldn't try, and you shouldn't start to look at the experiments and the things that you can create, almost like chain reaction. I mean, I'm sort of thinking that if anybody out there is going, I like a lot of how this sounds, how do I get going? It literally is, well, just get going. Find something worth doing, but recognize it's probably a catalyst for further exploration.
So that whole piece around if you're beginning to think that you'd love to kind of start to experiment in this way, but you're feeling isolated, feeling like a lone voice, how do you just start to kind of bring some people together into what you're kind of wanting to try and do? And actually, we've seen it time and again, you start to do some work with an internal team, whoever that is, wherever there's energy for doing something in a little bit of a different way. What that generally brings is when people can start to kind of go, oh, that looks a little bit different over there. How can I get a little bit more involved in that? And that kind of gradually drawing people in is a really kind of nice way of doing that. And so, for instance, we kind of quite often will find that it's someone in the people function who is wanting to experiment with something a little bit differently. Build a little team of allies around you. And, we'll often end up doing some development work with that type of team to kind of then help them to have a little bit more understanding of what are the types of practices or tools that we can use, start to experiment with. And then that kind of just gradually kind of spreads from that point forward.
You were making me think then about, again, the human aspects of intent and, creative urge or whatever it is, but then also that connectivity piece, like getting somebody interested enough in it validates me and what I'm thinking, gives me a double chance of making something happen. But I think you're right about the whole sense that it creates intrigue in others, like, what's going over there? We're naturally like that, aren't we? So instead of thinking I'm trapped in this system, if we see a few breakouts, we're like, ooh, maybe that could be us too.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, I mean, there's a big part in here around just how change happens within organizations, because, I don't know if you've come across the whole kind of monocentric versus polycentric change. And this idea, so for anyone less familiar with that, monocentric change is typically a kind of set of assumptions and beliefs that organizations don't change unless the leader decides it's going to change, which is not the reality at all.
No.
Polycentric change recognizes that change happens all the time. People are continually adapting to the environment that they're working within and operating within. And therefore, if you want to start to affect change and really kind of start to drive the change that we're talking about here, really embracing that polycentric change and really kind of helping to tap into pieces of energy so that, if there's a team that wants to start experimenting with something, it only needs one experiment that starts to slightly adapt this kind of current way of thinking or the current mindset. That adaptation itself means that the people there within that team who are then going to be interacting with other teams might start to interact in a slightly different way. We're talking about this, and this kind of idea that people then, they have their sort of the offstage conversations around what's going on, and they kind of go, oh, this is really cool, we're trying this. It starts to kind of plant seeds into way the kind of different organization, the organization could be different.
I love that, because it feels like you've almost kind of come full circle to the flip of human beings coming together to work in a humanized way to actually bring about change that matters not just to them, but to the whole thing that they're attached to. So, yeah, I mean, I'm thinking all the time, there's some cookie crumb trails you're leaving here for people to get more active, to try things out and so on. So, so thank you for all of that. As we kind of wrap it up, and like I say, we've almost gone full circle into the, how do you create a more humanized workplace? Well, let people humanize it. It's almost like the summary of all of this. Anything else that you wanted to add that we haven't covered yet?
When you say it like that, it sounds like it's really so simplistic.
I know, but I didn't want to make it sound like it was just that simplistic, but it really is the essence of, if you want to humanize the workplace, then let humans do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this, so any kind of final parting words or comments or thoughts, I think there's a big part in here around, we're seeing it time and again, around there being energy for people, that people are wanting to try to do something, but are finding it kind of tough going, finding it a struggle. They're kind of being, this sort of the polarities we talked about earlier, some of that kind of tension and conflict is kind of just making it difficult for people. So one of the things that we do, SSI UK, is really about kind of helping to kind of build a community of people who can support one another, who can share perspectives, share ideas, kind of come together and kind of just start to kind of help to normalize the fact that we are talking about work in a far more human way, and what that really means for, so whether people are kind of practitioners who are in the thick of it, trying to think about things a little bit differently, or the leaders and kind of going, I think there's a different way to do this, but I'm not quite sure how. Having that community that they can be connected into is a kind of big part of that. So, one thing, if anyone is out there listening to that and kind of going, oh, I'd like to kind of understand a bit more about what it would be to be part of that. We run a kind of an ongoing series of webinars and events and various different activities. So kind of look out for semcostyle.co.uk, connect with us there. Join up with us on LinkedIn, for instance, and you can just sort of start to see, actually, there's more and more stories. There are other organizations that are out there grappling with similar types of things, but are finding a way through it. Finding a way to do it.
I love that, because I remember when Fred Laloux was researching reinventing organizations and he was talking to Favi and Buurtzorg, as you say, and others. He was like, they didn't know about each other. They were doing brilliant things and they didn't know about each other. And I love the thought that there are people out there doing these great things and they just don't know about others. And this gives us a converging point.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and we would love to welcome anyone into that community. There's no expectation of what that means for people. They just want to kind of come along and listen to that would be great. Because the more that people start to do that, the more that we begin to recognize that we're not just these lone voices with these slightly abstract rebel ideas. Instead, actually, there's a real kind of movement of people who believe there's a totally different way of us being at work.
And therein lies that ripple effect that we know can have huge impact. So lovely. Barry McNeill, thank you very much for that. I lost myself in all sorts of thoughts and imagery. So thank you for that. And we've learned some new words, transtegrity or whatever, tensegrity. That's it. Tensegrity. I've got this image in my mind now of lots of organizations being more curious and more active in that whole sense of, actually, we are a collection of humans. Let's be that and do that.
Yeah, sounds great.
Thank you, Barry.
Lovely. Thank you very much.
If you've enjoyed this episode of Tomorrow's People, please subscribe and check out our previous episodes from wherever you get your podcast from. And if you want to transform your people processes, head to personio.com.